Actually, we're going to start today with a series of 3 polls just to get us thinking about the topic at hand. So I'm going to ask Melissa to launch our first poll, and hopefully you'll see that on your screen. And we're asking you to select the correct response to the following. So we're saying playing outside has been shown to build the immune system of infants and toddlers, provide and create opportunities for exercise, stimulate imagination, promote social skills, or all of the above. Anyone else want to take it answering?
Got a few responses.
Give it 2 more seconds. All righty. So it looks like we have some very smart people with us today. The correct answer is all of the above, which I think is fascinating. And I think it's also worth mentioning that these are just some of the known benefits. There are even more that we've learned through research that playing outside can contribute to. So our next question is asking, oh, my screen's not changing. Hold on. Okay, a true false statement here. Toxins in the air and soil affect babies, children, and adults in the same way. Is that a true or a false statement?
We got a few more people chiming in for this one.
All right. Anyone else want to take a crack? True or false? All right. It looks like 100% of you are correct. That is a false statement, and we're going to learn a little bit more about this during today's presentation. And our final question is asking you to select the correct response out of the following, and we're just interested to hear a little bit about how your legislative session was this year. So let us know, in your legislature, have you discussed the potential effect of toxins in the air, water, soil, and the potential effects on young constituents? So yes, this session, no, not this one, yes, but in previous, or no, we just have never talked about it. And any answer is fine. We're just sort of curious to get a sense of who's in the room.
Okay, we'll give it one more minute here, not quite. I think a few people are still chiming in.
Okay, well, it looks like some of you have talked about these sorts of topics, not necessarily this legislative session, and one could guess that perhaps COVID had something to do with that. So thank you all for playing along, and nice to just know who's in the room and what's going on. As it turns out, there are many children born in the US that grow up in communities where unemployment and crime are higher and schools are poorer. Access to capital, fresh produce, transit, and healthcare might be more limited, and exposure to environmental toxins is greater, in addition to family supports and services being fewer. And frequently, we find these communities and environmental components more negatively affect non-dominant families. So very much like Jamal, who we met in session 1 and have discussed throughout this series. So think about going to school hungry, or think about going to school with difficulty breathing, either from asthma or perhaps because of pollution in the air. It's quite possible that these examples could make going to school and learning a little more difficult, make it hard for you to be ready to learn when you do get to school. So today marks our 5th and final session of our 5-part series on early childhood development and well-being through a race equity lens. If you've missed any of the sessions, don't worry, we have archives, copies of presentations, and other resources on our alumni webpage, and Melissa's going to drop that in the chat so you can feel free to access any of that at any time. Let's real fast take a quick look at what we've learned so far together. So during session 1 in September, we discussed the history of racism in America. And then session 2 in November, we really focused our attention on maternal and infant health. In the third session in January 2021, we learned about housing, economic security, and the wealth gap. And then Melissa, I was wondering if you could unmute and share with us, remind us what happened 2 months ago in March.
Yes, thank you. In session 4, we turned our attention to early childhood education, and more specifically to racially biased disciplinary practices with children and low wages among early childhood workers. And we also discussed related policy implications for children and families. We learned about the extent to which Black children, and specifically Black boys, are suspended and expelled at disproportionate rates in early childhood education settings, that a majority of early childhood educators are women of color, yet these women in particular are paid even less among an already low workforce wage, and how the definition of quality in early childhood education settings must be expanded to include equity, such as eliminating disparities in disciplinary practices and building and supporting a diverse workforce to promote young children's school readiness. Today, we'll also be considering how states and communities include environmental factors in their definitions of quality in early learning settings, and also how the environment impacts early childhood development. So now we're going to take a closer look at characteristics of children's communities. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Allison.
Thank you. That was excellent. So there are a large handful of subtopics that can fall into this area. So nutrition and food deserts, both air and water quality, transportation issues, the quality of housing, and that includes things like safety or crowded housing, and additionally urban planning and community design and access or lack of access to green and safe places for recreation. So knowing we can't talk about everything, we've decided that we are going to dig in a bit to environmental toxins and their effects in homes, in the community, and in childcare facilities. We're going to discuss the importance of nutrition, and then spend a little time learning about the importance of green space and what's being done to make sure it exists and to make sure it's educational, and importantly, that it's accessible. So there's a lot to cover, and we're just barely scratching the surface. But hopefully our dynamic expert presenters will whet your appetite, and they'll make you want to go out and learn some more about these and other community and environmental factors. So during today's session, we're going to hear from 3 experts in the field, and we're also going to engage in a guided conversation to learn more about why environmental toxins can be so dangerous, especially for young children, along with the importance of nutrition. And then we'll learn about some problems and also some solutions related to childcare facilities and access to safe recreational and educational outside space. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Huerta, a pediatrician who's joining us today from Puerto Rico. Then we're going to move over and hear from Kathy Atar, joining us from the Washington, D.C. area. And we're going to hear about the Children's Environmental Health Network. And then lastly, we'll focus our attention with Sarah Conradi, located in Colorado, with the Early Childhood Health Outdoors, which is part of the National Wildlife Federation. You can learn more about each of these presenters on our website. Melissa will drop that into the chat if you want to learn more about their background. And after we hear a bit about their work, we'll have an opportunity to dig in deeper. So we're going to have a guided conversation. But of course, we want to hear from you. So do feel free to add your thoughts into the chat, to raise your hand and unmute your line. In particular, if you're wrestling with any of these policy situations and have solutions, we'd love to hear what your state has done or is doing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Huerta.
Thank you, Allison. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm grateful for the honor of presenting to you today. As a pediatrician and a mother, I'm grateful for all you do for all children. Next. This is my disclaimer. Next. Today, I will discuss basic environmental health and child development concepts, why the environment matters, how some children are disproportionately affected, and what we can do about this. Next. I must confess that as I was reviewing this presentation this morning with my husband, he made me realize how pessimistic and technical I sounded. So I had to refocus my line of thought. And I want to make sure that even though I will be discussing the adverse effects of environmental exposures on children's health, I convey the message that there is hope, that science has shown us what we have to do, that solidarity and compassion are fundamental to achieve any kind of positive change in society, and that you have the power as elected officials and policymakers to translate hope into action. The fact that you're here actually learning about these topics brings hope, at least for me as a pediatrician. Children's environment refers to the surrounding conditions in which children live, grow, develop, play, and learn. In a single day, that environment may include home, playground and parks, daycare, the car, as you see in the picture, the street and other public places. So this environment can be very diverse. We know that children depend on us adults to meet all their needs. The policies and enforcement of those policies and our individual and collective actions determine the quality of the air they breathe, the water they drink, the quality of the food they have access to, and the quality of care and education they receive. Children do not get to choose, we choose for them. So what we choose for them determines their present and future health, their quality of life, and if they will reach their maximum potential. Next. As we appreciate in this illustration, a healthy environment is one full of positive experiences. As a pediatrician, I invite you to look at each one of these in this list and reflect on how, from your position as a policymaker, you can promote one or several of these areas in your communities, and how you can develop ideas to create the infrastructure and generate the resources to provide your pediatric constituents with healthier environments and improve outcomes for them and their families. Research has shown that these positive experiences can actually help offset the fallout from adverse events. Next. In contrast, this slide illustrates some of the most common environmental exposures and events that have a short and long-term impact in the growth, development, health, and well-being of children. Again, I invite you to look at each one of these negative environmental exposures and reflect on how, from your position as a policymaker, you may be able to make changes to better protect our children from these exposures. Next. Children today live in an environment that is very different from previous generations. Every day, our children are exposed to a mixture of dozens of chemicals that did not exist 50 years ago, and they're on the rise. It is estimated that more than 80,000 chemicals have been in use in the United States. For the majority of these chemicals, not much is known in terms of their toxicity and safety profiles and health effects on humans, especially their effects in children's health. Other exposures that are also part of this toxic soup that we see in the picture include allergens such as mold and fungi, noise pollution, ultraviolet radiation exposure, and stress. All these make up the child's exposome, or the measure of all the exposures in a lifetime and how those exposures relate to health. Next. As we have seen, the environment is a major drive of health and disease. The foundations of health and well-being stem from the interplay between the genes you're born with and the environment. The WHO reported that in 2019, around 5.2 million children under the age of 5 years died mostly from preventable and treatable causes. And sadly, it is estimated that many of these deaths could have been prevented with access to immunization, adequate nutrition, safe water and food, and quality care by a trained health provider. In the developed countries, including the United States, there has been an epidemiological shift in the burden of disease in children. We have made great progress in preventing and managing communicable diseases, which once were the main cause of most childhood mortality, with the advances in sanitation and healthcare, particularly the invention of vaccines, But other risk factors, such as environmental exposures that are prevalent in modern industrialized societies, has shifted this burden from communicable diseases in children to non-communicable diseases. And these diseases have a prolonged course do not resolve spontaneously, have a complex etiology or causes, multiple risk factors, long latency periods, prolonged course of illness, and cause significant functional impairment and disability. Some of these are cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, cancer, overweight and obesity, neurodevelopmental, behavioral, and mental problems, and asthma. Many of these, as you know, are increasingly more prevalent at younger ages, and children from minority groups and living in poverty are at increased risk. Next. Children are at higher risk of adverse outcomes from environmental hazards than adults because of several factors. Children are not little adults. Next. Number one, young children live closer to the ground, not only because of their size, but also because they crawl and play in the ground, making them more likely to become into contact with dirt and dust, which can include toxicants. Secondly, children have unique activity patterns and behaviors according to their developmental stage. As you know, during the first years of life, they put things in their mouth, the hands, the toys, increasing the risk of ingestion of contaminants. Thirdly, children have physiological differences compared to adults. Children eat more food, breathe more air, and drink more water and fluids relative to their body mass than adults do. Consequently, they will be exposed to whatever is in food, water, and air. Next. Fourth, children's natural defenses are less developed. They have more permeable blood-brain barrier, so chemicals can reach the brain structures more easily than in adults. They have less effective filtration in their nasal passages, a highly permeable skin, and their digestive system, metabolic pathways, hepatic and renal clearances, and vital organs are still developing. Next. Of those developing organs, one that is extremely sensitive to environmental exposures is the brain. The preschool years is a time of rapid and dramatic brain and cognitive development. Environmental toxicants can have profound effects on the human brain. Scientists have discovered that even the smallest exposure can cause neurological deficits. This can be sudden and severe, but most commonly, they're delayed and more gradual, manifesting as neurological and psychiatric disorders decades after the exposure. There's a whole scientific area called neurospasmomics that focuses on methodologies to study the effects of mixtures of environmental exposures on the brain architecture and function. This scientific knowledge must be included as part of the foundation for public health policies. One example would be the case of lead poisoning. Low blood lead levels in young children can result in decreased ability to learn, decreased IQ, and behavior problems. Yet data from 2018 estimate that 3.6 million American homes with at least one child have significant lead paint hazards. To take care of this problem, we have to prevent lead from getting to our kids in the first place. And for this, we need healthier homes, schools, daycares, buildings, and public places. And for this, we need industrial emission guidelines in air, soil, and water that take into consideration those unique vulnerabilities of children that we have discussed. Next. All life stages are impacted by environmental exposures, starting at the ova and sperm level before conception. But there are specific windows of susceptibility during the early life stages and in puberty, in which the children's bodies are exquisitely susceptible to the damage caused by exposures to toxicants. So the timing of exposure to chemicals and other insults is critical in determining the consequences on child's health. This is why, for example, the same dose of a chemical during the first 3 months of pregnancy can cause fetal loss and birth defects and have very different effects from the same dose during the 9th month of pregnancy. Next. Child development refers to those milestones that a child must reach in the motor, cognitive, communication, adaptive, and socio-emotional areas to reach his or her full potential and well-being. Children develop at their own pace. As mentioned, several factors, including genetics and the environment, influence that development. The science of early childhood development is helping us understand how the environment influences outcomes. Translation of this science is something that we scientists are trying to do to help policymakers, care providers address some of our society's most critical problems, including the ever-increasing disparities in health, school achievement, economic productivity, and social outcomes across the lifespan. Pediatricians evaluate child development very closely to detect problems in a timely fashion, but also we try to help parents learn how to promote and monitor that development with a family-centered approach. And the main goal is that all children be able to grow up and develop where their emotional, health, educational, and socio-emotional needs are met. Next. As it was mentioned before, another environmental factor that we must address is nutrition. Nutrition is fundamental for good health and development during the early years of life. Food insecurity or inconsistent access to a safe and nutritionally adequate diet is associated with poverty. And food insecurity is happening in America and can have an impact in the quantity and quality of available food and contribute to deficiency of macronutrients like proteins and micronutrients such as vitamins and minerals. At least 4 micronutrients have been linked with neurodevelopment, including iodine, zinc, vitamin B12, and iron. Also, and importantly, certain nutritional deficiencies can increase the absorption and the effects of toxins. Again, the example of lead. Lead absorption is enhanced in children with iron deficiency anemia and also in children with diets deficient in vitamin C and calcium. School-aged children in food insecure households are at increased risk for academic and behavior problems. Next. Physical activity has become a major public health concern in many industrialized countries. Modern society commodities and barriers imposed by the built environment have resulted in some sedentary lifestyles, not only among adults, but also among our children. This, in combination with easy access to calorie-dense fast food diets, is associated with dramatic increases in the prevalence of pediatric obesity. It is now estimated that 1 out of 3 children in the United States is overweight or obese, and this has serious consequences in health. Also, the use of media and electronics is consuming an average of 9 hours a day of our teenagers' time and attention. These unhealthy sedentary habits start during early childhood. Regular participation in physical activity helps reduce the risk of childhood obesity and also promotes the development of cognitive and executive functioning that is both really important for school success, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and brain health in general. Science has also shown that play is essential to development. When physical activity and playing is performed outdoors, the benefits are even greater as the opportunity to connect into nature decreases levels of stress and improves mental health and health in general. To increase physical activity among children, we need policies that promote neighborhood safety and social cohesion, safer environments for pedestrians with sidewalks, protected bike lanes, street designs that slow traffic and make it safe to cross, and destinations within walking distance. That's the ideal world. Next. Children's early experiences have a profound influence on brain development and health in general. Nurturing and stimulating supportive and consistent relationships with parents and caregivers promote healthy brain physiology and architecture. That has been proven through numerous studies. On the contrary, experiences associated with growing up in poverty, toxic stress, and the lack of nurturing relationships can disrupt healthy brain development and have negative consequences for children's long-term outcomes. I would argue that stress is one of the most significant environmental exposures affecting all children, especially during the pandemic. I invite you to reflect on how public policies can help reduce resources of stress in the lives of children and families by increasing funding and access to mental health and medical services and affordable, healthier housing and quality education. One way would be, for example, to design and establish simpler rules for eligibility for basic services, and more humane and less stressful application and recertification processes. Next. Now I want to mention briefly the important role of air quality. Next. Ambient air pollution is the result of a mixture of toxic components that come from different sources, including vehicular traffic, coal-fired power plants, hydraulic fracturing, agricultural production, and forest fires. The combustion of fossil fuels produces particulate matter called PM2.5 and ultrafine particles that reach the smallest structures of the lungs. It also produces greenhouse gases, which cause and exacerbate climate change, and climate change worsens health effects of air pollution, a vicious cycle. Health effects linked to air pollution include, as expected, exacerbations of respiratory diseases such as asthma, and results in reduced lung function development. But the ambient air pollution has been proven to be associated with other conditions such as preterm birth, low birth weight, neurodevelopmental disorders, IQ loss, pediatric cancers, and increased risk for adult chronic diseases. That's a long list. The Clean Air Act has improved air quality. That's wonderful, but exposure inequities persist. It has been described that other effective strategies for reducing air pollution include ending reliance on coal, oil, and gas, regulating industrial emissions, reducing exposures to pollutants with attention to proximity of residences, schools, and childcare facilities to traffic, and a greater awareness of the Air Quality Index. We'll witness how the quality of air improved during the lockdown because of a significant decrease in fossil fuel combustion, as the use of cars and industrial activities decreased dramatically. Easier said than done, right? As a long-term goal, but it's very important. Initiatives such as increased use of public transportation have been proven to increase both air quality and community health. So again, as we understand the role of ambient air pollution and the cause of health and human suffering, we can apply all this scientific information when we design and develop public policy. Next. Between 8 to 11 million children receive daycare services in the United States for 10 hours per day, 5 days a week. High quality early education and childcare improves physical and cognitive outcomes and can result in enhanced school readiness. For many children and their families, poor quality housing traps them in an unhealthy and unsafe environment. In those cases, quality daycare and early education could represent the only opportunity of receiving healthy meals, be screened for developmental and growth delays, identification of social and family difficulties, and referrals for needed services, and an opportunity to be in a healthier environment. And we as pediatricians here in Puerto Rico and nationwide are very concerned about what happened with the disconnect between these services and kids because of the lockdown and the closure of schools and daycares. We have seen this during the pandemic, as I mentioned. Last February, the CDC published on their weekly morbidity and mortality report that between January and May 2020, 500,000 fewer children in the 34 reporting jurisdictions were tested for lead exposure compared to the same period the year before, in 2019. This means that approximately 10,000 children with elevated blood levels were missed because of decreasing testing. Lead poisoning can result, as I mentioned, in severe effects in children, and that include permanent neurologic damage, organ failure, and even death in the higher concentrations or levels. Public policy must support access to quality early intervention programs, comprehensive childhood developmental services, and quality care and early education. We must work together promoting healthy environments in early care and education supporting measures and decrease exposure to pesticides, lead, other toxicants, and promote safer cleaning and ventilation practices. Next. Research has concluded that climate change poses threats to human physical and mental health, safety, and security for all. On its Global Climate Change in Children's Health Declaration, published in 2015, the American Academy of Pediatrics lists the effects of climate change on child health and includes food, water, and nutrient insecurity, physical and psychological consequences of weather disasters. And I know about that with the hurricanes of 2017, and it's a nightmare. We're still living through that, going through that. Flooding, wildfires, as in California, for example, and on other states, heat-related diseases, decreased air quality, and alteration in the vector-borne disease patterns. In our pediatric practices, we're already seeing the effects of climate change in our patients. Take my own family, for example. In my home, We're already talking about hurricane season, which starts in 10 days. And despite having quality air conditioning, I had very poor quality sleep last night due to the very hot temperature. Imagine looking at your phone at 5 in the morning and seeing that it is 79 degrees outside. That happened last night. The last 2 days have registered record high temperatures on the island. I cannot imagine once summer starts. Climate change also threatens community and global stability. We're already seeing mass migrations and increased global conflicts due to scarcity of food and water in some areas, both linked to prolonged droughts. The AAP emphasizes that given this knowledge, failure to take action would be an act of injustice to all children. We need a paradigm shift in production and consumption of energy with less dependency on fossil fuel combustion. These changes can represent actually an opportunity for innovation and job creation, in addition to meet the immediate health effects and benefits that we would see. Next. There is environmental justice when all people are meaningfully included in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But the reality is that racial and ethnic minorities and people living in poverty have to live, work, and play in less healthy environments, do not have the ability to move away from toxic environments, and therefore suffer a higher disease burden. Communities of color and those with low education and high poverty and unemployment face greater health risks for environmental exposures. The effects of early disadvantage in young children persist over time. Low-income children are more likely to demonstrate delays in their cognitive, language, and social emotional development compared to their higher income peers before the age of 1 year. And this disparity continues, the gap continues to grow, and the chances of them dropping out from school has been documented to be higher. So we must continue addressing the roots of all these inequities and recognize the increased risks that children living in poverty and less healthy environments have. Next. These are just some pictures illustrating what I was talking about. The one on the upper right corner is in Puerto Rico, and you can imagine if you have a daycare center or you live in that area close to this petrochemical facility and you have no option to move from there, right? Or you can see on the lower bottom, on the bottom in the right side, after a hurricane and flooding and what that means for environmental exposures and long-term consequences for children is quite disturbing. Next. Good public policy decisions and practices are evidence-based. We need public policy that supports efficient and effective maternal, newborn, and child health systems and policies that support quality care and early education. Good education translates, as we have discussed, to better lifestyle choices, health outcomes, community productivity, and social stability. We need the development of policies that address air and water pollution, climate change, open spaces and built environments, and social determinants of health and disease, considering the unique vulnerabilities of young children. We need policies and services that promote healthier brain development. Some of the most impactful measures and policies you can sponsor that can contribute to a safer, more secure, and healthier nation are those that are child-centered and directed towards improving children's outcomes, ensuring healthier environments for all of them to grow and to develop. Thank you so much. Now back to you, Alison.
That's terrific. Thank you, Dr. Huerta. We had one quick question that I want to clarify, and I apologize, Rep. Drummond, for not seeing this sooner. On one of your earlier slides that says the environment is a major driver of health and disease, there's a stat from 2019 that 5.2 million children under 5 years died, mostly from preventable and treatable causes. And to just clarify, is that worldwide or US?
That's worldwide.
Okay, and thank you, Kathy, for your response. We had good information. So thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to share some information with us now.
Hello, I am Kathy Attar, and I'm the program manager for the Eco Healthy Childcare Program, which is a project of the Children's Environmental Health Network. If you could go to the next slide. And the Children's Environmental Health Network has been around for over 25 years, and it is a national organization really trying to look at how children's health can be impacted by their environments. Essentially, everything that Dr. Huerta was saying about children's vulnerabilities, that this is what the network is focusing on. And we are trying to bring awareness around through education, training. We are part of quite a few different national collaboratives, including the Cancer Free Economy Network, the Lead Service Line Replacement Network. And so these are just some of the things that the Children's Environmental Health Network focuses on, and it's kind of how they do their work. Next slide. And my particular program is called the Eco Healthy Childcare Program. And this is also a national program. And our focus is specifically on the childcare sector. And again, really looking at kind of the intersection of how the childcare environment can really be improved upon through the elimination of environmental hazards like pesticides, lead, unsafe plastics. And we are really focused on kind of solution-based. So we offer free and low-cost best practices to childcare professionals, providers, childcare licensing agencies that are trying to create healthier early learning environments. We offer free resources, we give technical assistance, we have training, both online and in-person training. And then we also have an actual endorsement program for childcare facilities. So home-based childcare providers or center-based providers can actually be endorsed by us if they meet certain of our best practices. And we have what's called an Eco Healthy checklist. And on that checklist, there are 30 essentially best practices that will help providers reduce exposures to environmental hazards in their facility. So if they meet 24 out of the 30 best practices on that Eco Healthy checklist, providers can get endorsed by us. And so that is kind of a way, to protect children and staff, but also can be used as a marketing tool for providers. And so in terms of the Eco Healthy checklist, if you go to the next slide, these are kind of the topics that we focus on, both in that Eco Healthy checklist, but then also in our resources, our fact sheets and FAQs. These are the environmental hazards that we look at through our training and our projects. Next slide. And so as Dr. Huerta mentioned, in terms of childcare, there are millions of children each year who spend most of their time or quite a bit of their time in childcare facilities. So that's kind of one reason why we think we can have great impact is that children spend a lot of time in childcare facilities. Another reason why we are focusing on childcare facilities is because there have been studies and research that shows there are environmental hazards, harmful chemicals in these early learning centers. And there's also, as Dr. Huerta has mentioned, kind of strong evidence that when you're exposed to these certain environmental exposures, particularly in children and babies, it can be linked to poor health outcomes, whether it be asthma, learning disabilities. And so that's kind of another reason why we're focusing on the early learning environment. Next slide. And I would just say in terms of equity, and I believe in some of your previous webinars, you kind of focused on the idea of systemic racism in different sectors. And I would just say kind of as a result of racist policies like redlining, oftentimes Black, Brown, and communities with lower incomes are living in environments that are more polluted, right? And so when you're talking about childcare facilities, particularly home-based childcare facilities, they could be placed in substandard housing. So that could mean they're in a childcare could be in a home that has a lot of mold or mildew because the pipes are not kept up, or the house could be an older house where there's lead paint or even lead in the water. And so the substandard housing and home-based childcare, many children are cared for in these types of environments and situations. And so it's, in terms of equity and justice, this is, really why when we talk about environmental health, environmental justice, the, equity piece is kind of top of line. Next slide. And then finally, just another kind of reason why the Eco-Healthy Childcare Program was created was the fact that, unfortunately, when you're looking at the childcare field, there isn't much of a focus on environmental health. When you're looking at professional development, as most people, you all probably know, many childcare providers, they need to earn certain learning clock hours every year, right? But unfortunately, within that system, there really isn't any or not many much training or education around environmental health. When you're also looking at childcare licensing regulations, there are some states that are looking at lead in water, lead in paint. Some have some pesticides reduction programs, but unfortunately there isn't kind of a great emphasis on environmental health, which is another reason, like I said, why the Eco-Healthy Childcare Program was created. Next slide. And so how do we, the Eco-Healthy Childcare Program, the Children's Environmental Health Network, and the groups that we work for, so how do we kind of address that gap in knowledge in the childcare field when it comes to environmental health? Like I said, we have a plethora of resources on our website, fact sheets, FAQs. I just wanted to highlight one in particular. We created a lead safe toolkit for home-based childcare in collaboration with the National Center for Healthy Housing and the National Association for Family Childcare. And this kind of toolkit is really comprehensive. It focuses on lead in water, lead in paint, soil, and consumer products, and it includes both policies and worksheets that childcare professionals can use to really take a look at their home environment to see how they can eliminate lead within it. Next slide. And then kind of one of the last few things I wanted to focus on was some of the projects that we are involved in that are looking at trying to change best practices and childcare health and safety standards. We work with one of the projects we are involved in is called the Choosing Safe Places for Early Care and Education program. And that's a project with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is a part of the CDC. And we work with state health departments to help them try and implement projects or programs in each of the funded states. Not every state is funded, but I believe 26 of the states receive funding from the CDC to implement these safe siting projects. So essentially what we're trying to do is when a childcare provider wants to open up a childcare center, we would like the state health departments to let them know about or to inquire about whether or not the facility they want to open is going to be in or next door to a hazardous waste site, or is it in a former facility that has a previous industry that might have a polluting industry. And so we're really working to try and change how state health departments and childcare providers, when they are trying to open up facilities, trying to get them to see kind of the environmental health hazards that might be around them. When it comes to childcare standards, we've worked with several national accreditation organizations, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NACE, has a national accreditation program where providers can become accredited by them. And we've worked with NACE to embed some of our eco-healthy best practices within their accreditation standards. And we've worked with several others, including the National Association for Family Childcare, we're currently working with them to actually create some lead standards within their accreditation program. And then finally, in terms of kind of changing practices and policies, we've also worked with several states, including Maryland, to look at their quality rating improvement systems to see how, again, they can kind of embed environmental health best practices within those quality rating improvement systems. Next slide. And then I just kind of wanted to end with kind of the idea that, of course, this year and COVID and the pandemic has had a tremendous impact on childcare providers, families, essential workers. And however, I do think because of the emphasis on childcare and improving childcare quality, there is an opportunity, particularly also with the current Biden administration and federal funding, this idea of, childcare as infrastructure. And when I think of that, and when our program thinks of that, we're also looking at it from a lens of environmental health. So trying to see, yes, creating better facilities, but can we make those better facilities also with improved ventilation? Or can we look at what types of materials are we going to be putting into these new and improved childcare facilities? And so I do think, kind of ending on a point of opportunity, I do feel right now there is an emphasis on childcare, improving quality, and also because of the pandemic, somewhat of a spotlight on health and safety. And so we would like to expand that definition of health and safety to include also environment and environmental health. Next slide. And that's just kind of my contact information. So you can, different ways to get in touch with me. We are on Instagram and Facebook, where we on a daily basis kind of are putting out some of our best practices out there too. Thank you. And I turn it back over to Allison.
Thank you, Kathy. That was so excellent. I appreciate that. I'm going to look in the chat just to make sure. Jenny, you got, okay. Let's see. I'm going to turn things over to
Allison. There was a question from Senator Petty, actually. Kathy, could you share how to find out if
oh, yes,
one
Sure.
state that is a part of the CDC program?
Sure, I will put a link to the ATSCR Choose Safe Places program. There's a map on there, and it tells you what states are involved.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Senator Penny. Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm going to turn things over to Sarah Conradi from Early Childhood Health Outdoors to share some information with us. And again, if you do have questions, pop them in the chat. I'll try to monitor them. And when we're done with Sarah and we transition to the panel, do feel free to unmute and have a conversation. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Sarah Conradi. I'm a licensed landscape architect, and I'm the program director with National Wildlife Federation for the Early Childhood Health Outdoors program, or ECHO. And just appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you all today, especially in the context of the previous two presenters. It's a very nice theme to be able to really kind of nest this information, especially in the bigger picture. Next slide, please. So our team really works to make sure that every young child is experiencing nature daily for the health of kids, community, and planet. And we know, of course, as the previous two speakers mentioned, that the outdoors is a critical contributor to the health and well-being of young children. And not to forget, of course, their caregivers in those settings. And outdoor quality in licensed childcare centers is often overlooked as a strategy for supporting whole child development. Next slide, please. And so I'm part of a multidisciplinary team of landscape architects, designers, so really looking at that built environment focus, but also early childhood specialists from an activation and programming perspective, and policy experts as well. So how we can really, through community engagement, through shifts in the built environment and practice, how can we create healthier places for children in the spaces, as we heard, where they're spending so many of their waking hours and having so many of their first experiences. So just want to share with you oftentimes what we see when we go to work with providers across Colorado and now across the country to improve the quality of their spaces. Next slide, please. This is often the baseline conditions that we're seeing. And I share this with you with permission from the program that we were visiting on this day. This is a program that we've worked closely with now for over 4 years. And really want to ask the question, you know, this is a highly rated program. This is a quality program. Wonderful staff, wonderful practices. And this is the space where young children are spending their outdoor time, which of course is a requirement by the state licensing rules and regulations. But want to ask the question if this is really a space that is truly supportive of learning and healthy development. And not just once, but day after day after day. Children who may use the space are age 3, 4, 5 for their requirement of time outdoors. And so this is a playground over a parking lot in a strip mall, which is not uncommon. And I do think that we'll see more of these scenarios, right, as we try to shore up the system in the coming years and being innovative with where our childcare programs are operating as well. And so, you know, that adaptive reuse of these types of spaces is something that we want to encourage, but we also want to think about how we are holistically thinking about the quality of the experiences that children are having. So this space is very safe. It meets that criteria, but it pretty much ends there. It's not supporting a variety of learning styles. It's not supporting the needs of children with different interests or abilities. And really, I want to frame this conversation as to how we can move beyond these more traditional playgrounds and reimagine them as true outdoor learning environments. And so I want to show you what that might look like. So next slide, please. So this is the same playground, but it's been enhanced, and this is still in progress, right? So this is a journey. This is not extreme playground makeover. This is really about modest enhancements and small investments over time that are driven through community engagement, community needs. So sort of inserting resources as they become available to really enhance the choices and diversity of these spaces to improve children's health outcomes. So there's an outdoor classroom, there's blocks, a mud kitchen, water play, STEM center, flower and vegetable gardens, which are so important. And just off the camera, there's a trike pathway for gross motor activity and lots of other settings that you can't see in this image. But the owner of this program, Michelle, has told us about some of the changes that she's seen in the children and staff since they've made these changes. And she says that this has completely transformed the way that they think about outdoor play, learning, and discovery, and that they see and feel these benefits every day. When their infants get to go outside and touch and smell plants, when the toddlers sit and enjoy the quiet space in their sensory area, and when the preschoolers are feeling the wind blow as they make their way around the trike path, while their friends are just nearby and they're building a pirate ship in the loose parts area, and that this transformation has impacted positively their children's behaviors, their staff interactions, as well as their parent involvement, which I mentioned before. And I just want to emphasize that this is happening in the fenced-in parking lot in a strip mall in suburban Denver. So this can happen anywhere. This is an absolutely adaptable and scalable strategy. And Michelle's observation, which she's so articulately shared with us, is really backed up by a large body of research, some of which I'm emphasizing and repeating based on the first two presenters. But natural outdoor learning environments with a diversity of features and choices are much, much better than traditional playgrounds. Next slide, please. And I want to make something else clear. This is not about field trips or visits to nature, which are wonderful. This is about the daily experience and the places where young children are spending most of their time. So this is really about those accessible, adjacent outdoor spaces in these licensed care settings. So we know that time outdoors in these higher quality spaces is supporting young children's physical health, of course. And it's proven that time outdoors in nature boosts the immune system. And I think that is never been more important than today, than the time we find ourselves in now. When children play in these environments that are designed and activated using best practices, they move more. So in fact, they're 22% more likely to engage in moderate to vigorous physical activity after these spaces have been renovated. And in addition, they're spending time outdoors, more time outdoors in all seasons, which of course is correlated with additional physical activity. And that finding has been replicated across multiple states and in multiple climates. So some people say, oh yes, of course, that's easy to do, in a mild climate. It is also something that can be practiced in multiple climates across the country. And of course, we spoke about nutrition earlier. So thinking about involving and engaging young children in growing and producing fresh, healthy food. And so that hands-on production, gardening, introducing young children to new tastes and new foods that they help to grow. It really helps them to develop those healthy eating habits and set them off onto that healthy trajectory. Of course, time outside is also in these spaces is supporting cognitive development, including increased concentration, greater attention functioning, reducing stress levels, excuse me, by supporting children's mental health and caregivers as well, want to mention. In addition, supporting and promoting social emotional development, because we know that children in these spaces are interacting more positively to caregivers and to one another. Because we found that children in nature who play in nature have more positive feelings about each other. Their play is more imaginative, more creative. We know that creative play encourages language development, social and collaborative skills, and that feeling of self-efficacy, so important, right? That feeling of I can do it. I believe in myself. I can do it. It comes with age-appropriate risk-taking and incremental challenges. And we know that in responsive environments like these, high-quality environments like these, it makes it possible for more children to really kind of incrementally approach those healthy risks, as opposed to all children being provided with one singular experience that's focused on gross motor development. When children are in these spaces, they're engaged in longer periods of self-directed free play. The space isn't really dictating how they interact and engage with it. And in addition, supporting high quality inclusion, which is so important because these spaces can be more easily modified and adapted given the unique needs of the children who were in the program in care at that time. And then once these spaces have been renovated, again, very modest, affordable renovations. There's a reduction in challenging behaviors because these non-traditional spaces are really empowering teachers to plan for the positive behaviors that they want to see outside. And that's a really important distinction, again, as we make that shift from playground to outdoor learning environment, thinking about teachers having the power and the ability to activate these spaces just as they would their interior classroom environments. And again, as I've mentioned, but just want to emphasize again, children are not alone in these spaces, and these are benefiting caregivers as well as we talk about workforce outcomes in this critical time in the childcare system. And also want to speak to the reduction in existing equity gaps as the result of the creation of these spaces. So research suggests that children disproportionately suffer, of course, the long-term developmental consequences of limited experiences in nature and time outside. Specifically, children of color, children in families living with low incomes are more likely to live in areas without quality parks and access to green space. The Center for American Progress calls this the nature gap. So this is just a shocking statistic. Across the US, 3/4 of census tracts with large numbers of children and families of color live in so-called nature-deprived places. And so for children who lack access to the developmental benefits of nearby nature in their home environments due to systemic racism and its impact on the built environment, bringing nature into the quality equation of licensed care is a way to offset this disparity at a systems scale. And it's so important to remember and just really understand that for many young children, time outside in the licensed childcare setting may be their first and only consistent outdoor experience. And so the good news is that these everyday experiences are affordable, as I've mentioned, and they're also scalable. Next slide, please. So many of the health outcomes that I just mentioned, those can be realized with very modest investments. And you, as I said, don't need an extreme playground makeover, which is exciting and thrilling, but you don't need it to create a better outdoor learning environment. These spaces can be constructed incrementally with ongoing family and community engagement. And so importantly, you can incorporate children's voices into the planning of these spaces, which results in really unique, equitable, and culturally relevant outdoor play spaces. Next slide, please. And so this strategy, which we really consider a health equity strategy, is innovative, but it's not a new idea, right? I think we probably all share the common collective memory of time spent outdoors as children, and the impact that may have had on us developmentally as we come to this place together today. So it's not a new idea, but in this moment, it's urgent, it's accessible, it's adaptable, it can work anywhere, as I shared, suburban, urban, rural, and I assure you that our team has seen it all. It needs investment in places and practices and supportive policies to make sure that the developmental benefits of the spaces like the one that you're seeing right there, it's just such a beautiful image of babies spending time in the space, making sure that these benefits are available to all children. Thank you very much. And now back to you, Allison.
Sarah, thank you. I've got a quick question that came through from Senator Petty on the chat that I'll read. She was wondering, have you found, well, now it jumped, hang on. She was wondering, have you found that reimagining the play areas is not extremely expensive, and are there grants to help with this? Do you have any comment?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Certainly modest, small changes can have a big impact, and that's a really important message that I want to share. We know that for young children, right, those small changes, which is actually more appropriate, right, than making large changes all at once for young children, can really set the stage for continued kind of step-by-step incremental investment. There are some grants available. Oftentimes they're limited to nonprofit programs, which is a barrier for those, you know, and I hesitate to use air quotes, but for profit, which is not always the case when we're talking about licensed childcare programs and the razor thin margins that they're operating under. And so there is, I would say, a disparity in access to funds that can support the creation of these spaces. We are seeing some glimmers of hope now, and I think we can talk about that a little bit more during the panel discussion as to how some of these current federal funds can be used to improve outdoor spaces, and not just thinking about play equipment, which is the traditional way that we think about improving playgrounds, but also in landscape features and other types of immersive or sensory experiences that young children could be having outdoors. So I'm happy to share a little bit more about how these spaces could be funded, but it is currently limited with the grants that are available.
Thank you. So, excuse me. Now what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to bring up my colleague, Melissa Minsick, and we've got a series of questions that that she'll go through with our presenters. And again, if you have anything to add, keep popping stuff in chat. It's so interesting to see what's happening. And again, and if you want to ask a question, do feel free to unmute and ask. And we'll do this for a little while. So hang tight while I play with technology. It's still a little new sometimes. Stop sharing. Okay. There you go. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you so much to our presenters for being here. It's so interesting and just really informative to hear all about these things from your unique perspectives. That's something that we haven't really shared with our audiences previously. And so this has been a learning experience for all of us, NCSL staff included. So I just want to kind of jump straight into the panel. And I'd like to hear everybody's answer to this question. It's been alluded to, or some people have actually directly called out, the pandemic. It's kind of undeniable. We can't ignore it. How would you say the current pandemic has affected your work this past year? And also because of it, how do you see it affecting your work in maybe like the next year and then longer term? So whoever wants to go first is free to jump in.
Well, I'll do it. From a pediatrician standpoint, we've seen several what we call collateral effects of the pandemic. We know that this virus has been more aggressive, obviously in adults, and the older you are, the higher the risks. But in children, we've seen several things that increase their adverse long-term outcomes.
Doctor, I think you're frozen.
Because of this, and decreased access. Can you hear me? Decreased access
It's cut
to
out.
referrals. Decreased referrals to those services that they need to improve outcomes, specifically developmental services, different kinds of therapies, or referrals to specialists to take care of different medical conditions in a timely fashion. So we've seen that this pandemic has had impact on all the different areas that I mentioned on the presentation. And obviously, because of the lockdown, they haven't been able to be outside as much. They're not socializing. So we're even talking about our kids learning to be outside again because of the prolonged time that they've been confined in their own homes, which is totally not normal for children. And this has a long-term impact on them.
I can jump in and follow up on that. It's really interesting. Just, I would say, kind of a year ago now is when we were just starting to see this guidance coming out of spend more time outside, get outdoors. That's where it's safer. And I'm speaking particularly for the licensed childcare industry. So those programs that were still operational, that were serving perhaps critical employees, children. So roughly half of the programs in our state were closed, but the rest were being told to get outside. And so it was very interesting. We saw an immediate uptick in inquiries into how can I, as a provider, start to enhance what was previously just a space perhaps considered to just go outside and burn off some steam. But not a space that was really ever created or designed to spend a substantial part of the day in. So not shady, not comfortable, just not conducive to all of the types of activities that needed to take place out there. So we shifted pretty rapidly. We created some guidance, looking at the guidance that different states were operating under from the CDC, and the support that was being provided to centers and programs. And so we created some kind of simple adaptations that could be made if groups were needing to be segmented outdoors, how they could activate very simply their spaces with additional shade. And then we shifted some of our additional funding, some of our existing funding to support a microgrants program so that we could help providers to make some small enhancements to their spaces that would make it more functional, more usable, and of course, provide them that safety and peace of mind of spending more of their time outdoors with children. So interestingly, driving that desire to be outside in those spaces and for the peace of mind and the physical safety of that reduced transmission of the virus outdoors.
And I think for us as well, I think some of our work has been shifted to, I had mentioned the Choose Safe Places program that we had been working on with the state health departments. And so once the pandemic hit, that work kind of went on hold, and we actually got some funding and resources, again, through the CDC to work with these same state health departments to focus on guidance around childcare, specifically cleaning and disinfecting, ventilation. And so I would say, I don't know if you want to call it a silver lining, but I do think the pandemic kind of brought somewhat a renewed focus to environmental health within the childcare field. There was initially that heightened emphasis on cleaning and disinfecting. However, we now know that wasn't necessarily something that probably should have been a focus, as opposed to, increasing the emphasis on ventilation, since we know COVID is a airborne disease, primarily through aerosols, transmitted through aerosols. And so, but I do think that to say that the issue of health and safety and the issue of the environmental health within childcare was more of a focus. And I think kind of going forward, we would like to see that continue. And I guess in terms of an equity piece, many childcare providers, particularly home-based providers, are kind of operating on very slim margins. And so they might not have access to safer products, safer cleaning products, safer disinfecting products. They might not have an HVAC system in their childcare facility. And so I would just say, you know, when we're talking about improving the quality of childcare, looking at childcare facilities, childcare as infrastructure, we have to keep kind of those aspects in mind as well.
Great, thank you all so much. So for the next question, we've talked about a lot of subtopics today, right? We touched on environmental toxins, access to green space, healthy eating, all of these different pieces. They're often looked at really differently, very distinctly. So let's spend a little bit of time thinking about how the intersectionality of all these things is possible and why these items should be considered together. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to share.
I guess just for me, if you're looking at kind of the nutrition piece and the healthy eating, and I think for us, getting more fruits and vegetables into children is a definite. But I think we would also like to add to that whenever possible, we would like to make sure those fruits and vegetables are, you know, lower on the pesticide. So if you have access to organic, there have also been studies that show that a family that goes on an organic diet for 2 weeks, their levels of pesticides have reduced greatly. And so these changes work. But we also know many communities don't have access, right, to these affordable, healthy options. And so I guess I would just say, you know, when you're talking about nutrition, we also like to think about pesticides. Also, along with the food, we also look at some of the packaging that food can be put into. Canned food can be high in BPA, which is a harmful chemical, endocrine disruptor. We also, one of our tips is to never microwave food in plastics, because that can also help leach out some certain chemicals that are in the plastics that then get into the food. So those kind of more of a holistic idea of healthy eating in terms of that piece. And so same thing with kind of when you're talking about parks and green spaces. When I had mentioned the Choose Safe Places program that looks at where childcare facilities are sited. And so for us, that also comes into play. Yes, definitely, children should be getting outside. They should have access to outdoor environments, but we also want to make sure those environments are healthy and safe for them. They're not next to a gas station or a dry cleaner, or children are not going outside when there's heavy air pollution. So kind of all of those different aspects kind of come into play for us as well.
Yeah, adding to that aspect of safety that you mentioned, when children go outside to play, which is so important, but then again, protection from sun radiation is really important, choosing the right products, and then also consideration of all these changes that we're seeing due to climate change, and hydrating our kids better when they're going outside, being mindful that they have to take water, and making sure that they go to a shadow when they're not outside when the sun is too intense. They're in more shaded areas. So being mindful that these things are going to continue being a problem increasingly because of the changes that we're seeing in our climate. And we're already seeing these effects.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and just briefly share. I appreciate, again, just the contextualization of this. And we talk so much about, you know, these site-based improvements, but really in the bigger scheme of things, thinking about, right, growing healthy foods. What practices do we need to have in place? Time outdoors isn't just time outdoors. There are other practices and protocols that can be put into place to ensure that that time is optimized. and that we aren't potentially creating, additional negative impacts of that time outside, right? Due to, a poor air quality day, which is so common where I live, right here next to the Rocky Mountains and all of the inversions that we experience here in the Denver area. It is a really critical issue. And so I just want to share kind of this thinking of some of these improvements that I mentioned as kind of like micro restoration practices as well. So we're thinking about improving the quality of this one site. It's also the environmental quality, the experiences for children, but again, increasing that shade, perhaps a small bit of mitigation in that kind of urban heat island effect through tree planting, through vegetation, through reducing asphalt and concrete and that kind of thing. So thinking about the way that all of these overlay, even in a 3,000 square foot fenced in parking lot, it's just really important, I think, to put into perspective the way that these small changes can have a big impact. When we think about, again, we shared the number of children in licensed care across the country, millions and millions of children, millions of facilities. If these small changes are happening across the board, it can make a really, really big difference.
Great, thank you so much. I think we might have time for one final question, and that question would be, can you tell us a little bit more about how do we improve connections between pediatricians, childcare programs, and policymakers? How do we bridge those gaps? What are your thoughts on that?
We need to continue doing activities like this one, not just, sporadically, but maybe something more formal and with an itinerary and share experiences. And now that we're more experts in using these kind of media, virtual meetings, is something that we would definitely look forward to continue meeting and discussing these issues.
I would just, say in terms of, a takeaway is that like these environmental exposures are preventable, right? This is something that can be prevented. And so I would just also say that there are a lot of best practices and models that exist. And so, if you're looking at from a state perspective, if you're looking at quality rating improvement systems, some states have adopted some of our eco-healthy best practices, for example, Maryland. So you can look to those states. There are certain states are now requiring licensed childcare facilities to test their water for lead. So I think, there are models and best practices out there. So we know kind of what to do. It's just kind of now taking the next step and seeing, if we can get some of these models and best practices in more of childcare facilities, in more states, in more, localities, essentially.
And one thing to follow up on that, Kathy, I appreciate that point. Childcare providers are overwhelmed and inundated with programs and ideas and just meeting the daily regulatory guidance, which is still changing, not to mention from week to week as to how they're operating currently. And so just as much as we can create synergies and really synthesize the intersectionality of all of the ideas that we're sharing and not just have these kind of disparate buckets of here's a grant for this, here's some resources for this, oh, another toolkit. I think the time is now, right? I think we as partners, as supporters, really need to kind of pull some of these pieces together. And maybe that's through policy levers, programmatic synergies, but there has to be a way to continue to elevate and convey this information that doesn't feel burdensome. And so I would just make sure that we're considering just how these ideas are put into practice as well.
Great. Thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. This is such an awesome conversation. I could sit here and ask you questions all day, as I'm sure we all could, but we are running out of time. So thank you again for your time, and I will turn it over to Jenny Palmer.
Thanks, Melissa. Give me 1 second here. All right, well, thank you again to our presenters. Such great information. I was scribbling notes furiously. we just wanted to take these last few minutes together to really sort of tie a bow on all of this and reflect on where we've been in this series, as this is our final installment. And it has been quite a journey. I know for those of us on the NCSL planning team, it's been really eye-opening and has forced us to sort of broaden our understanding of the influences on early childhood development beyond, early learning settings where we typically focus. So all these other, impacts on lifelong health and lifelong learning, and adding the critical lens of race equity to all these systems. I know for me has really helped. It's been very powerful to understand that we've heard from expert after expert that when we center equity in all of these policies, we not only lift up those who have been marginalized and underserved, but really benefits all children and all families. We hope that you found these offerings complementary to what you learned as an early learning fellow, hopefully learned some new things, learned just some of these familiar issues in a different light. And we're hoping that you have a few takeaways of your own or aha moments to share with us in just a few minutes. But here's a few things that jumped out to us. So we began in the beginning, understanding the history of racism and discrimination built into so many of our policies and practices and systems, including neighborhoods and access to housing. If you joined us in January for our session on housing and economic stability, Dr. Brissett shared this really startling picture of this bridge built to essentially divide neighborhoods. The bridge is too low for buses, and which was the primary mode of transportation for Black people at the time, whereas white people had more access to cars that could fit under here. So really, the whole idea, that discrimination built into the environment of separating neighborhoods and separating access to resources. And then Dr. Brissett helped us to connect how these policies, these systems, these environments continue to affect families and children today. So we also discussed in session 3, the separation of these neighborhoods, the inequitable investment in neighborhoods is connected to the current enormous gap in home ownership for Black families and white families, and how home ownership is how we build wealth for most families, how we build wealth over time. And so it's really at the root of the persistent gap in household wealth between Black families and white families. So, what else? These are just a few examples, but we learned a lot about different discriminatory policies and underinvestment in nearly all aspects of life and how they're affecting life currently, for Black families and children, including maternal and child health outcomes, again, housing and neighborhoods, but we learned even more about that today in terms of exposure to environmental toxins and risks, as well as healthy and safe childcare settings. And of course, access to well-paying jobs, economic mobility, home ownership, long-term family, generational wealth. We also talked about, even including today, talked a lot more about the early learning settings and the inequities built within those systems, which contribute to inequitable access to safe, healthy, high-quality early learning opportunities, disproportionate rates of suspension expulsion for Black children, lower pay for educators of color, and more and more. We're hoping you'll share what else you learned. But we also focused on some state policies and programs that are working to address those inequities. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. We touched on so many promising and evidence-based policies that are working to address these inequities, including extending postpartum care, restricting the use of credit scores to housing, to access housing and employment, to early childhood mental health consultation within early learning settings. It's proven to reduce the incidence of suspension expulsion, culturally responsive home visiting programs supporting families and parents, and of course, resources and funding that are available to help early learning facilities to make them safer and healthier. We would love to hear from you though. We'd love to hear what you learned, what your takeaways were, even if you only attended today's or just a few. We would love to know sort of what stood out to you and what your next steps are. And to do that, we just want to mix things up a little bit. Still sharing my screen? Did it stop? No.
Jenny, your screen, I was sharing this. So let's see if the Mentimeter comes up on your end. Yes, yes, that works. Perfect.
So Allison has dropped in a link to Mentimeter. This is should take you right to this poll, and we would love if you could just share a sentence or two, a couple words about what stood out to you either today or in past sessions. Again, that link is in your chat from Allison, or you can follow the instructions at the very top of the screen where it says menti.com and the code. I'm going to pull it up on my own phone. And CSL staff or others on the line, anyone is welcome to chime in here too. Share what stood out to you today and other past sessions. And you can answer multiple times. Great, I'm seeing some reflections from today's series on the importance of outdoor space. The benefits to the workforce, not just the children. A few reflections on some of our, on maybe the series as a whole. The continued impact of racial disparities within our policies, engaging children holistically. It's great. Give you one more minute if there's any last things you want to throw in. All right. One final question is just, what are your next steps? What do you see yourself doing with all the information that you have gained in the last few months of this series? And again, not an exhaustive list. If what is next for you is not listed here, feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat. Fun to see your responses showing up here. I wish we had used this format earlier in the series. Well, thank you for playing along. I know we're getting close here. We're just right at 90 minutes and we want to be respectful of your time. So let me just stop sharing here. And just want to say thanks for sharing, and that whatever your next steps are, know that we are here for you at NCSL to support you in any way that we can. And I'll hand it back over to Allison.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today, joining us for the series or some part of it. I want to give a big shout out to the Buffett Early Childhood Fund that has sponsored this 5-part series. I want to give a big shout out to our 3 expert presenters today. They were excellent, and we probably could have kept talking for a really long time, but as Jenny said, in the interest of being respectful of your time, we wanted to cut it short, but we're here for you. So reach out if you have questions or follow-up questions or thoughts. Just send an email and we will get an answer for you if we don't know. I want to mention that we just accepted our 9th cohort of early childhood fellows. So I'm going to share with you all shortly an updated list of who's part of that and what states. So maybe if their states are the same as yours, you might want to connect with them and encourage them. We've got 2 new webinars coming up that we'll share registration links for soon. One is about youth and young adult homelessness. A second one is about child welfare financing. So crossover issues that I think would be interesting to many of you. We're going to drop a link for an evaluation. It is important for us to know how we're doing and to figure out how to improve. And this is also going to help us think about our next alumni series offering. So take a few moments and complete that survey. The great news, everyone that completes it can get a $5 gift card to Starbucks. So some caffeine or maybe non-caffeinated coffee if that's your thing, but fill that out. And then the last thing I just want to say, we'll send an email out shortly that will also include materials from today, which are up on our website. And in that follow-up email, we'll send registration links for those webinars I just mentioned. And again, do remember, NCSL is your organization. We are here for you. So reach out, ask questions, call on us. And we can't wait to see you all again when we do our next installment of the NCSL Advanced Alumni Learning Series. So thank you all and have a great day and excellent weekend.